Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 RCPP Town Hall webinar series called Creating Your Proposal. My name is Sarah Henderson with Metaphase Consulting. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Today is May 15th, 2024, and this session is being recorded. We have over 100 participants registered for this webinar, and we look forward to presenting to you today. Just a few items on our agenda today. First, we'll start with some announcements, then we'll talk through the Town Hall webinar series. We'll focus on today's topic, the funding request, and we'll wrap up the last portion of our call with a Q&A. You'll see on the right side of the screen a QR code for the survey. You'll see this pop up just a few times throughout today's session. We appreciate and welcome your feedback, so please be sure to scan the QR code and share your feedback with us. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to go over just a few announcements. The webinar slides and recording for this webinar will be posted to the RCPP website as soon as possible. The recording will take just a little bit of time to be reviewed and updated for 508 compliance, and then it will be posted to the website. Presenters will introduce themselves with camera on and then turn them off to conserve bandwidth, so I'm going to go ahead and turn mine off. The camera and mic will be turned off for the webinar for participants for the duration of the presentation portion. But the chat is active and you can ask questions throughout the presentation. The answers to those questions will be provided in that second portion during Q&A. If we do not answer all your questions today, we will provide follow-up responses and an updated FAQ document posted to the RCPP How to Apply webpage. We'll also post links to important resources in the chat for easy access. And as I mentioned, throughout the presentation, you'll notice a QR code to a survey. We, again, really appreciate your feedback. If you could take just a minute to fill that out. In addition to today's webinar, we have 5 more sessions that will cover each section of the proposal. The registration links are on the RCPP website under the How to Apply page. In addition to this webinar series of Creating Your Proposal, the Easement Division will be hosting an RCPP easement webinar, and that's scheduled for tomorrow, May 16th, 2024, from 2 to 4 EDT. There'll also be another RCPP outreach webinar on May 30th, 2024, from 2 to 4 EDT. It's going to cover the same information as that initial session on April 23rd. Just one more announcement as a reminder. The deadline to apply for application assistance for projects that support underserved entities in critical conservation areas is this Saturday, May 18th. If you're interested, you can use the RCPP Notice of Funding Opportunity Proposal Support Questionnaire to submit an application. And you can download that form from the RCPP How to Apply website. When you submit your application, please just use RCPP Proposal Support Request in the email subject line. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bree Hebron, to continue.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for participating in the webinar today to learn more about the funding request section of the proposal. I'm going to go on camera just briefly. My name is Bree Hebron with Metaphase Consulting. And RCS has engaged with Metaphase to support outreach and education, and we're joined on this call by our RCPP team to provide support for this Creating Your Proposal series. As we cover this topic today, please remember that if you have any additional questions that we don't get to, make sure that you're contacting your state RCPP coordinators. The contact information for your coordinator is available on the RCPP How to Apply website, and we will drop the link in the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera just to save everybody's bandwidth, and we'll go ahead and get started. So as we mentioned, this webinar is just one of the series of town hall webinars designed to help all applicants understand the proposal requirements, and this series is open to everyone. So just as a quick sort of reframing of where we are, over the next several weeks, you've got the option to attend any of the additional webinars in this series that are going to focus on a specific part of the proposal, and we'll have a Q&A session with each presentation. The webinar topics flow in the order that we suggest you work through your proposal responses. It's going to be slightly different than the actual order that you need to enter your application in the RCPP portal, but we're going to discuss a little bit of that today. So last week, which we hope you were here for, we covered capabilities to perform technical assistance, and today we're going to cover funding request. We also have two information session webinars, one on easements that Sarah mentioned, that's tomorrow, and then also the general outreach session repeat that she mentioned on May 30th. So just to align a little bit to that slide. So we always want to start by sort of figuring out where we are in the process. So at this point, you've been thinking about and deciding on which type of project, if you're going to have CCA or state or multi-state. And if you're not sure which one, remember that for the critical conversation area, your project must fall under the established boundaries. So again, that's a great discussion to have with your state coordinator if you're still unsure. And then you also need to be making a decision as to whether you're applying under the classic or the AFA. The information that we're providing today and that we provided last time are going to all sort of align to some of those decisions. So as I mentioned last week, we discussed the capacity to perform technical assistance, which is actually going to tie in and lead us into our funding request discussion today. So now we're going to jump into the specifics of the funding request section of your proposal. We're going to do a brief overview. We're going to talk specifically about financial assistance and then about technical assistance. And then, like I said, we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So let's go ahead and get started with a general overview of the funding request section of your proposal. So as you all know, just to cover the basics, the RCPP funding available for a single project, if it is selected, ranges from a minimum of $250,000 to a maximum of $25 million. So you're going to enter the funding request in the portal in two separate sections, one for financial assistance, or FA, and one for technical assistance, or TA. The discussions we've had in prior webinars and the hard work that you've all been doing in making the decisions about the FA and the TA and all those considerations in your proposal are going to help you to budget for these two items. So we're going to cover some of these points in more detail throughout the presentation, but here are a few important points that I want to highlight right off the bat. So we want to make sure, and I'm going to say this several times throughout the presentation today, but make sure you're having discussions with your state coordinator on how much TA and how much FA should be requested. This is going to be critical. We're going to emphasize this several times and talk about some specific points that you want to be covering with your coordinator. So one of the considerations that you want to be factoring in as you're building your budget is that you're including a sufficient amount of technical assistance to support all of the financial assistance activities defined in the project. So those two things have to match and align. While you're planning, make sure you're aligned to a 25-75 split. So 25% should be going towards technical assistance and 75% to financial assistance. We're going to talk about that in more detail as well. You can indicate in the portal that you want to request a variance in that split, but your proposal must be submitted with that 25% to 75% split. I also want to note that the portal is automatically going to add NRCS technical assistance to the proposal budget to ensure that that split is correct. But remember that any partner technical assistance that you enter is going to reduce the amount of NRCS technical assistance. And again, like I said, we're going to cover all of this in more detail as we proceed, but it's so important that you should be meeting and discussing all of these things with your state coordinator to determine the appropriate funding request for your proposal. Specifically, the appropriate split of the funding request for implementation technical assistance between NRCS and partner, as well as the split between implementation technical assistance and enhancement technical assistance. The other important thing that I really want to highlight before we start getting into details is that as we talk about the overall funding request, remember that the reimbursable financial assistance and technical assistance activities can only begin once the project is selected and a proper agreement is in place. So with that, let's go into some of the specifics about the financial assistance funding request. So you're going to enter the funding request specifically for each activity type included in your proposal. Your proposal can have a combination of different activity types. So one example would be that you would have land management, land rental, and easements all included in the proposal. So in that specific example, you'd enter a specific funding request amount for each of those 3 activity types. I also want to note, and that's covered in the table here, that the 5 different activities follow the associated cover program's rules. So for example, if you are applying to do land management, you may be following the environmental qualitative incentives program or conservation security program rules. For each activity type included in your proposal, you'll enter the information that's shown at the bottom of the slides. This includes activity type, funding year, state, amount, and description. So for example, if you entered the activity type as land management, the description could be financial assistance for NRCS practice or enhancement-based activities. We would like to offer the EQIP-like practices. Or if you're planning to offer rentals, then that could be similar to what is done in the Conservation Reserve Program, and you'll enter that again in those fields. Make sure you understand the requirements for the covered program that you'd like to do, especially, and this is particularly important if you're planning to apply for an AFA. So for land rentals, an example of a description could be expected to use for short-term targeted land rental will follow standards NRCS processes and NRCS developed land rental rates. For AFA projects, if it requires a specific schedule, you can enter actually a separate funding request amount for an activity for different years. And that's, again, something that you can discuss with the state coordinator for your AFA projects. And then we've got some reminders just on some of the different activity types on the right side of the screen for your review. So one thing that I do want to highlight, so we're going to get into a lot of the details of the narrative questions in the next couple of sessions that we have, but be aware when you're thinking through your funding request that some of the proposal narrative questions might be related. There are some specific questions highlighted here and on the next slide that go into some of the specifics of the FA, and as you're building your budget and planning your funding request, pay attention to these questions to make sure that your answers will align to the specific activity types and the funding request amounts that you're planning for. So I'm not going to go into too many of these details on the narrative question since we have those 2 upcoming sessions on this topic. So we've got one covering the classic narrative questions and a separate session covering the AFA narrative questions. But again, for narrative question 2, this is going to be related specifically to the activity types that you're choosing for financial assistance. And then on the next slide, we've also highlighted that narrative question 17 and narrative question 18 also relate. So again, have a little bit of a preview and look at some of these narrative questions that we've identified here to make sure that you're accounting for what your answers are going to be while you're building your budget for your funding request. So now we'll talk about some additional specifics of the technical assistance funding request. So this is going to be entered into 3 different amounts. So for technical assistance, it's going to be divided in some of those things that we talked about last time. So we've got the partner implementation technical assistance, we've got the NRCS implementation technical assistance, and enhancement technical assistance. So just to give you a couple of examples of some of the descriptions of TA funding requests. So for enhancement technical assistance, it could be collaboration with partners to quantify water and soil savings as well as waterfowl habitat provided. For implementation technical assistance, it could be partnership field staff time and travel to meet with project applicants where screening, ranking, and assessment tools will be completed and turned into the local NRCS office, or time and travel of partnership field staff to meet with producers and plan and implement plan structural and management activities. And so, it really gets specific to technical assistance where I want to emphasize again how critical it is to make sure that you're discussing that funding request breakdown with your NRCS state coordinator. And we're going to talk through some of the details here because it's really going to impact how that layout happens to make sure that you've covered all of the necessary activities. Okay, so just as a quick refresher, let's talk about some of the specifics of implementation technical assistance and how they align to your funding request. So as you all know, implementation technical assistance is required for conservation planning, practice design, installation and verification, easement contract management, and other needs associated with supporting the implementation of RCPP conservation activities. So for RCPP Classic, the implementation technical assistance funding defaults to NRCS, but it might be awarded to qualified partners if a project is funded. Just remember that no matter who is handling these activities, all implementation technical assistance activities must be carried out according to the applicable federal requirements. Remember that NRCS implementation technical assistance funding needs to cover the full NRCS roles. This is one of the many reasons it's so important to work with your state coordinator to make sure that that's fully covered. For alternative funding arrangements, partners are expected to deliver implementation technical assistance except for the NRCS non-delegable tasks, which we'll cover next. So we wanted to highlight these non-delegable TA responsibilities since they're not part of the funding request. So these responsibilities include developing and managing programmatic partnership agreements and supplemental agreements, classic program contracts, NRCS program management responsibilities, and process payments. So highly erodible land conservation and wetland conservation, adjusted gross income, and National Environmental Policy Act related decision making, eligibility determinations and producer contract activities, as well as project-related communication and coordination. So these are all the responsibilities that must be performed by NRCS, and they, no matter what the project is, NRCS retains these responsibilities. So as a reminder from our last session, here are the eligible activities for implementation technical assistance. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see the fields you enter into the portal, including technical assistance type, the state, the amount, and then the description. So one activity example could be a state forestry assistance program where foresters providing field level planning as well as support contractor with practice design and installation. So in this example, you'd enter the technical assistance type as implementation TA, you'd enter the state and the amount, and a description could be, and this is just an example, ABC Forestry Assistance Program foresters will provide field level planning as well as support contractor with practice, design, installation, and follow-up. They will assist XYZ partner with site assessments to determine species suitability and preliminary practice design, including for those few practices offered to historically underserved producers. ABC foresters will also work with XYZ partner to complete practice checkout certification when the third-party contractor indicates practice completion. So that's just an example of what the description of the technical assistance would look like, could sound like when you're entering it in the portal. So just as a few other things to keep in mind, land management activities are typically going to have the greatest potential for implementation technical assistance to be delegated to an eligible partner. For entity-held easements, most due diligence activities are required partner contributions. For U.S. held easements, most of the implementation TA is performed by NRCS and can't be delegated. And then for watershed projects, most of the implementation TA is expected to be performed by an eligible partner according to an approved watershed plan. So just a few things to keep in mind. So pivoting to enhancement technical assistance, some example activities and descriptions could be outreach and training to contractors and landowners, site assessments, coordination of conservation district foresters, and BMP inspections. So some descriptions could be Partner 123 Forest Carbon Climate and climate program will lead carbon analysis, lead knowledge transfer and sensing on climate and carbon topics, and lead economic analysis, tracking and reporting on project outcomes. So keep in mind that enhancement technical assistance can be earned by partners for project level activities, but all field level and producer landowner level conservation implementation activities are funded by implementation technical assistance. Activities like project management and outcomes assessment are some solid examples of enhancement technical assistance. And also, like other RCPP funding, enhancement technical assistant payments are only made for verifiable completion of those eligible negotiated tasks associated with active award. So now that we've talked about the financial assistance and technical assistance included in your funding request, let's go into greater detail about that 75%, 25% split, and specifically how to request something different if that's what makes sense for your budget. So as we discussed, your proposal must align to that 75% financial assistance and 25% technical assistance split, but you can propose a different allocation of funds to be considered if the project is selected for funding. So when entering your proposal information in the portal, you can request a financial assistance, technical assistance variance. So you'll just essentially say, yes, I want to request a variance. And then you'll need to enter a justification into the portal as well, where you'll want to explain what your project budget is for both financial assistance and technical assistance, and why this would be the most effective rather than the 25% to 75% split. And then the final steps in your funding request are to document your organization's ability to perform technical assistance, focusing on the capability and capacity to perform TA. So for capability, what you're going to want to focus on is the certifications, the educational background, and previous related experience of those who will be performing the tasks, and how to essentially demonstrate their capability. So for capacity, you're going to want to focus on the time of the tasks, and also the number of people assigned to the tasks to show that that you have the capacity to do that work. You'll also upload required documents to the portal as that final step, and this is going to include any documents that support what we just mentioned. So it's going to support your description of the capacity and capability of the partners to perform those TA activities. You're also going to want to upload any documentation reflecting partner cost structure, outlining valuation methods proposed for use in tracking eligible tasks and associated costs. And then if you're including watershed activities in your proposal, you must upload an NRCS approved watershed plan. So on this side, I just want to highlight the resources that you have access to. And again, as we've mentioned several times today, make sure that you're really working out the details of your funding request with your state coordinator, and that information is here. All of this is available on the How to Apply site, and make sure that you're raising any questions that you have about anything with regards to access to these. So with that, I'd love to jump into our Q&A session, and I'll hand the presentation over to Seth to address your excellent questions.
Well, hey, that was a surprise. I wasn't quite paying final attention there. I appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you. Hey guys, this is Seth Fiedler. Maybe I should turn on my camera so you can see what my ugly mug looks like. I am an NRCS employee. I've worked for headquarters on the RCPP program for about 8 years now, and they've asked me to help answer some questions today. So that's what I'm going to do. The first question that I have on my list is, how do we enter the specifics of TA in the portal? And I think the confusion, it says it was confusing last year. I think the confusion likely ties back to the basic model for TA in an RCPP project. So I'm going to start with that basic model. And if I don't answer your question, please pose a refined question that more closely aligns with whatever I miss, right? So the real complexity of TA requests in a proposal relates to the eligibility and sort of the tiered order of priority for how RCPP uses funds. It's really important to understand that RCPP appropriation from Congress comes with two kinds of money: financial assistance money and technical assistance money. The TA, or technical assistance money, is provided by Congress to deliver the financial assistance per agency policies and requirements. So that means if it's land management, it has to follow a practice standard or an enhancement activity job sheet. If it's an easement, it has to go through a full due diligence process, etc. Sorry, I'm going to turn off my camera real quick. But ultimately, those TAI needs are really closely aligned with the FA that is being installed in a given project, specifically the RCPP FA, not the contribution FA. So what we say in RCPP is FA comes first, because that's the purpose of the program. TAI to support that FA comes second, and TAE, or Partner Project Management money, comes third, only if there's enough TAI to deliver the FA per spec. And then, so within the TAI bucket, there's also a split. There's partner TAI and NRCS TAI. And the only way to get at who's going to get what TAI is for the partner to sit down with the lead state coordinator and really discuss, hey, what FA is going in this project? And then NRCS can probably inform the partner, hey, partner, this is going to demand these certain kinds of TAI. And are you going to provide them? In an AFA project, the partner's going to have to provide them. In a classic project, it's sort of a choice, partner or NRCS. So in that partner or NRCS part of TAI, the partner can propose anything they want. NRCS is responsible for ensuring that whatever TA gets ultimately negotiated in the PPA is going to be sufficient to deliver FA to spec. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, whatever you demand of us, partner demands of NRCS, we're going to reserve TAI for that first, because that's the only money we can spend in a project. We can't supplement our appropriation with contributions like a partner can. So you set up your TAI to address whatever roles NRCS is going to need. You may set up some more TAI to provide whatever TAI the partner is capable of providing to NRCS specs. And then if there's TAI left in the budget, you can start budgeting TAE. So that's the tiering. And as the partner's question suggested, it's not easy to know what the right budget is before you go into a proposal. And even, oddly, once your proposal gets selected, until you start to get FA applications from eligible producers and you start to really hone in on the exact FA activities that are going to be installed and the exact TA that goes with those FA activities, it may be hard for that budget to be accurate. So basically what we set up in the PPA is a budget that says, okay, we have this much TA in the project. It's not going to turn into an immediate obligation. It's going to turn into a 5-year commitment for the life of the PPA to make TA available, and then we're going to start to obligate it. We may obligate it right away per the proposal if the partner has a good TAE request and we have enough TA in the project. But ultimately, some of the final decisions about TA don't come from the proposal. They come during the project implementation phase, whether that's during PPA negotiations or later when the project's actually engaged and you start to get, oh, this producer needs a design and we didn't reserve any money for any TAI for design. Well, we're going to have to tweak our budget and come up with that either from the NRCS side or the partner side. That's how we have to manage these projects. So it is a bit of an iterative process. And the communication between the partner and that lead state on who's able to do what TAI is really critical to figuring out not only how FA is going to be delivered, but also whether there will be any TAE available in the project. So hopefully that's a long-winded answer to a pretty open-ended question. The next question on my list says, negotiating and establishing PPA and supplemental agreement contracts is listed as a non-delegable NRCS task. Can the lead partner also allocate TA to cover their side of contract development? So this is very much a reflection of that last question, right? But it's a very specific example. The partner is asking, hey, I get that NRCS needs a certain amount of TA to do this non-delegable stuff, and I get that that comes out of the budget. Maybe they don't, but they should. And it comes out first. Once that budget that NRCS needs to manage the supplementals and PPAs comes out, any producer contracts as well, can the partner allocate TA to cover their side of contract development? Maybe, because it only becomes possible as TAE, and TAE only becomes possible after all of the TAI needs in a project have been met. So if in your discussions with the state, you determine that, oh yeah, we're going to have plenty of TA in this project to support both NRCS and or partner delivery of TAI to deliver the FA, then partner may propose project management expenses such as supplemental agreement negotiations or PPA reporting outcomes, etc. You can propose those as TAE at the end. But like it says in the proposal, you shouldn't necessarily expect every eligible TAE expense to be RCPP funded. One of the expectations of Congress when they set up this program was that the partner bear, quote, a significant portion of the costs as contribution, unquote. So often that happens in the project management side of the partner equation because there's not quite enough TAI to fully fund everything the partner would like to get paid for. But it can also work out where the partner does get paid for everything, just depending on the FA mix in the project and the specific TA that goes with that. Can you define more clearly how watershed projects are different than land management projects that may impact a watershed? Can you combine land management and watershed projects in one proposal? So this is an understandably complex line. Basically, anything that we do in an EQIP contract, which uses NRCS conservation practices, is what we call land treatment. Those practices plunk on the land and they do something for the benefit of resource concerns. Interestingly, so too do watersheds. Watershed projects, even right up to the big watershed dams that we plunk out on the landscape, are practices. Dam is one of the NRCS conservation practices. So you could plan that practice under either the land management activity type or the public works activity type. And the partner wants to know, which one should I do? How do you decide, NRCS? And the way we decide is by looking at the authorities provided to us and the requirements placed in what's called the Principles, Resources, and Guidelines for Water Resource Projects. That PR&G is a guidance document that sits way above NRCS. It applies to all federal agencies that deal with water projects. And basically it requires that if a water project is going to create a new impact on the landscape, i.e. it hasn't been previously analyzed in detail, and or the scope of that project starts to get bigger than our what we call job approval authority for land management practices in typical situations, then you sort of transition from land management to public works, i.e. it's a matter of complexity and potential environmental impact. So what you should do if you have a project that, as the partner's question poses it, has the potential to impact a watershed, and you're not sure if it needs to be a watershed activity project or a land management project, talk to your lead state coordinator. Talk to them very specifically about what you want to do in that project. If it's financial assistance practices installed on land, basically under producer control and for the benefit of producers, that's probably going to be land management. If it's land management practices installed on an easement owned by a public entity that deals with water management, it's probably public works and watersheds. That's the simplest version of the line, but there's lots of other little considerations in there. So talk with your coordinator and figure out if there's a way to stay on the land management side of the line, because you avoid a lot of complexity in environmental analysis and economic analysis that's required on the watershed side. And you can't even apply for watersheds unless you have approved watershed plan. So if you don't have an approved watershed plan already in place, which is one of the requirements of the NFO to participate in the watershed activity type, if you don't already have an approved watershed plan, you're not even eligible for a public works project under this NFO today. So you need to be talking to that land management or that RCPP coordinator in your lead state and figuring out if what you want to do in your project area can fit under the land management activity type. And then let's see, I can't figure out how organizations get reimbursed for administering the grant. RCPP is not a grant and you don't get paid for administering it. So that's probably why you're not finding a simple path to that. What RCPP does potentially pay for, and this was in my second question as well, is that TAE that is associated with project management, if there's sufficient TA in the project to deliver FA before we get to that project management expense. And then we still don't pay for it by grant, we pay for it by specific task. So you're going to have to negotiate a supplemental agreement with the lead state that documents those specific tasks that you think are involved in project management, and they agree with you and funds get obligated and paid out for that specific eligible TAE task, not for the generic administration of the grant. We have an NRCS approved watershed plan. I'm assuming that very little TA would be required. So I'm assuming that having the approved plan would help us provide justification for the TA/FA variance request. Is that correct? Also, with an approved watershed plan, how much supporting documentation to provide TA do you need to provide if a partner is primarily requesting financial assistance? So there's an interesting little bobble here embedded in this question, and I understand why the partner is asking it, but I'm going to sort of take us back a step. In the NFO, it stipulates that a waiver request during the proposal does not equate to waiver approval. So that's an important thing to consider, right? Like you're going to request this FA to TA variance in your proposal. Even if your proposal gets selected, your proposal has not been approved for a variance, it still has to go through that process. It's very, very likely in almost every situation, including this watershed situation, that a TA to FA conversion will be supported by the agency. We love to see more money go on the ground for the benefit of agricultural producers and addressing their resource concerns. FA is great. So if a partner through prior work, maybe it's on this watershed plan funded by NRCS, or maybe it was a partner-led watershed planning product that NRCS subsequently approved, doesn't matter. They've got an approved plan in place. That approved plan is sufficient to not have to replan the project. Now, of course, we're still going to have to do design. So the real question, how much TA is needed in the project, is a lot more detailed, right? Watershed plan is not enough. You actually need a design potentially, or maybe you don't. Maybe you're only doing land management practices. But how much TA is needed in the project is going to depend on what the project is going to do within the watershed and RCPP authorities. Those are so broad that I can't answer the specific TA question posed here, but I can say we can absolutely consider existing products and residual TA demand in a project, and we'll ultimately approve TA to FA variances so long as we have money in our apportionment for Congress. So that's the one other limiting factor, but we usually can get that adjusted. FA to TA conversions usually happen. TA to FA conversion, TA to FA conversions usually happen. FA to TA conversions, the opposite of what the partner's question is about here, rarely are approved. So if you're thinking, oh, hey, this 25-75 split doesn't favor TA, and Seth just told me that I can't have TAE unless TAI is sufficient in the project, I think I need 35% TA. You're going to have a hard time selling that one to the agency. I'm not saying don't propose it, but I'm saying it's a very hard sell. I don't know that we've approved any of those waivers recently, maybe one in the 18 Farm Bill period, where the partner was delivering a vast amount of FA contribution and didn't have TA to support that contribution FA. They were going to do it to our specs, so there was a real obvious basis. Less likely to get FA to TA waivers approved than TA to FA waivers. Next question. Where can one access current NRCS approved watershed plans? If you are a watershed sponsor, then you've been previously engaged with NRCS over some period of time, and you've developed a watershed plan, you have that plan. If you're not a watershed sponsor and you have not gone through that effort, then I am unaware of any repository where you might find locally available plans. So you really just need to be talking to water management entities in your area to see if anybody's been doing that kind of work. Next question. For time and travel that can be listed under Partner TAI, as stated earlier in this webinar, what rate is used? So the rates that we are allowed to pay are actual cost incurred by partner for eligible expenses. So if we're going to pay time, we typically pay based on the rate that a partner pays its staff, exclusive of administrative components of that payment, if any. So like if your billable rate, for instance, the most obvious explanation of this is there's a real difference between a billable rate and a actual payment rate. What RCPP will reimburse the partner for is the actual amount that the partner pays the staff member. We will not reimburse the partner for the billable rate of that staff member if the billable rate includes any administrative expenses, i.e., if the billable rate of one of your planners includes secretarial time or a portion of secretarial time, we can't pay that secretary time through the hourly rate associated with the planner. It's just not a thing. Only this money that the partner pays out to the planner is eligible. Can include fringe benefit. Travel is even harder because then we're looking at, okay, where did they go? Was it necessary and incidental to an eligible expense? Similarly, the TA that we pay for has to be tied to an eligible expense at time of obligation and at time of payment. And hopefully that helps. Next example, could you give some examples of acceptable supporting documents to be uploaded to show capability of partners to provide TA? Resumes, support letters, a statement document. It is also, well, let me answer that one first. Ideally, if you are proposing to provide staff to do specific kinds of tasks, you would show us that staff's capability. So resumes or vitas. If you've got engineers that can do engineering, great, show us those. If you've got planners that can do planning, show us those. Better still, show us how many planning products and what flavors they delivered, right? Like that's, and you're starting to get to actual qualifications. The folks have done it. If you can't get that far, then you're going to be fine with some kind of story. A support letter, not so much. Like we don't really care whether somebody thinks that something's a good idea. You need to get to actual qualifications and actual rates. So that's what you should be focused on. Is it also applicants' responsibility to conduct project audits and implementation verification, or can this be done through enhanced TA? So in an AFA project, the partner is pretty much responsible for everything and should have a vision for everything. So from planning, application assistance, ranking, planning, design, installation, and checkout. Probably some kind of quality assurance process on whoever's doing the checkouts. Really, they should be doing everything that an RCS does. On the classic side, the split is much more negotiable. And on the classic side, a partner wouldn't necessarily have to do any TAI. And if they're not qualified, we would hope they wouldn't ask for any TAI. We would hope that they leave, roughly 18% of the TA on the table for NRCS to do planning, implementation, design, and checkout. Either way, though, at the end of the day, whoever gets the TAI budget to do the initial planning, etc., NRCS is still going to come back at the very end and do a 5 to 10% spot check on payments. So hopefully, whichever party did the checkout at the time of initial installation was correct, and the audit supports that. But cumulatively between the two of us, we should both be doing checkouts on every parcel and then quality assurance on a select percentage. So hopefully that helps. For AFA, if TAI will be delivered by lead partner, would the 75-25 breakdown for TA and FA be the same? Absolutely. We would expect that ratio to hold across all projects, and actually probably to be substantially lower in many projects on the TA side, and I'll explain why. Land management, where we are doing one of two things, structural practices or management practices. Most of our management practices have relatively low TA demands. Most of our structural practices have relatively high TA demands. So even in a land management only project, depending on the FA demand in the project, the true demand for TA may not be 75-25. You may be able to get away with less than 25%. And in most entity held and US held easement projects, we would expect you to lead less than 25% TA because there are very few TA roles for the partner in those kind of FA activities. And NRCS TA demands associated with those are not at the 25% rate. The 25% rate comes from our EQIP program and is the program that has the highest TA ratio that we fund routinely. So again, think about those TA demands in terms of the FA activity that you're delivering and plan accordingly. Is there an example of how applications are ranked? I don't have an example available, but here again, if you talk to your state coordinator, on the classic side, we do all of our ranking through a system called the Conservation Desktop application and a piece of it called CART, application ranking and assessment tool or something like that. And I'm sure the lead state coordinators could show that to you. On an AFA side, the partner's responsible for coming up with a fair and impartial ranking and should be describing it in the proposal. Should outside engineering services be AFA or should they be RCPP Classic? TAI to support engineering services is, I believe, the subject of this question, but there's no specific guide towards Classic or AFA. It really boils down to what FA is being delivered and who's going to deliver the TA to support it. On the Classic side, NRCS is poised to support design, engineering, and checkout. So we could do it. If a partner is also poised to do it on that side, then we would need to look at costs and timing, et cetera, and figure out who should be doing it. On the AFA side, we would expect the partner to be delivering the engineering services. Is the overhead percent for partners capped? RCPP is statutorily prohibited. This is a big one. RCPP is statutorily prohibited from paying partner administrative costs. So yes, the overhead percentage is capped at 0%. All we pay for is the eligible expenses incurred by partner at the actual cost incurred by partner. We can't pay any sort of profit. We can't pay any sort of overhead to a partner. Interestingly, if the partner turns around and hires a contractor, then as long as that's done by a competitive bid, et cetera, we can potentially pay contractor administrative expenses with a valid bid process, et cetera. We cannot pay partner administrative expenses. Can you address pay-per-performance as an AFA approach? Where is in the budget would payments to producers go? Can payments be made for performance during the contract period? I better answer these a couple of times. Can you address pay-per-performance model? Sure. Generally speaking, pay-per-performance means that a partner is going to engage a producer to install certain practices to address resource concerns on their land. And then after they install those practices, which the partner needs to plan and design per NRCS specs, after the producer installs those practices, the partner is going to make a payment to that producer, but they're not going to pay based on the NRCS typical cost to install a particular practice model. They're going to pay based on something else. Maybe it's the modeled nitrogen reduction associated with the implementation of a cover crop. If they've got a defensible model that says, okay, applying this cover crop on this soil type at this location, this time of year with these crops in play is going to reduce nitrogen applied by X, then they pay based on X per pound. That's what pay-per-performance means. It's statutorily allowed as long as in AFA, as long as the partner's paying it out to the producer. It's an actual cost incurred by the producer or by the partner. So it becomes eligible for reimbursement to the partner. Where in the budget would payments to producers go? They would show up as FA in the applicable activity type, probably land management in almost every case. Can payments be made for performance along the during the contract period if the practice was implemented before the contract period? No, we only pay for things that we, result from our contracts, right? If it already happened, then it's got nothing to do with our contract and we're not going to pay for it. Can research to finalize appropriate performance assessment methodologies be included in the budget? And if so, how would that go into TAE? No, it really can't. You got to have a model that's at least all but done, because if you can't contract in the first year or two of your AFA project, you only get 5 years to pay out all the money to the producers. There's no long contracts in AFA. So if you don't have your model ready to start obligating right away, you don't have a ripe project for pay-per-performance. For entity-held easements, which part of the due diligence are expected to be done by NRCS staff? Would it be part of the TAI funding request, and which part are entities' responsibilities, and could they be considered contribution? It's a great question. It highlights a whole bunch of interesting things about entity-held easements, namely that the only NRCS due diligence responsibilities with respect to entity-held easements are an appraisal technical review of the appraisal provided by the partner, and potentially a hazardous materials record search if the partner does not elect to do that piece on their own. So very limited things that NRCS funds can be used for. And no, we do not use TAI for those. We use FA. So the entity held easement FA activity budget request in the proposal needs to be sufficient to support two things: the federal share of those entity held easements and those two very specific and very limited due diligence tasks that NRCS has to pay for. Everything else that the partner has to do in order to earn the federal share of that partial contract in an entity held easement is potentially credible as contribution if it is completed during the term of the PPA and in the PPA table of deliverables when it's time to report it. So essentially, you need to have negotiated the inclusion of those contribution items or entity held due diligence items as contribution, and then you can report them at the actual cost to partner. How do you recommend quantifying how much time goes into providing TAI in an AFA for NEPA compliance and all of the activities associated with TAI in an AFA? So this boils back to the FA activities in the project and understanding the mix and the associated planning requirements that are incumbent upon them. So if you're planning land management, you need to understand which specific practices are likely, how much planner time is needed for those specific activities during planning, design, checkout. You're going to have to go through all that kind of analysis. There's no way around it. I can't give you a generic number. There is no generic number. If you're not ready to think about an AFA at that level of detail, you're probably better off thinking about a classic and leaving most of the TAI for NRCS to do. Because if you're not familiar with our practice standards and then planning procedures, et cetera, at the level to let you estimate those times for the type of FA that you're doing, yeah, you're probably not ready to provide the TAI that is needed. Eligibility question. Can land management practices be applied on state-owned land through RCPP to achieve a specific conservation goal? Per language in the NFO, public land is limited to lands, installation of RCPP funded assistance on public lands is limited to situations where an RCS approved watershed plan will be implemented, i.e. we're putting a dam on a public easement, or a producer has control of those state lands, public lands. So for instance, and I think the language in the 23 NFO, which is referenced in the 24 NFO, says if a producer controls a mosaic of public and private land and the work will benefit both, then you can install RCPP work on state land. Long-winded way of saying absent a tie to producer control, you're probably out of bounds working on public lands. If you have a very specific situation beyond that, please consult with a state coordinator in your state. Staff time includes fringe benefits, potentially yes. What else can it include? Payroll tax, yes. I don't know all the things that are allowable or disallowable, but the main thing to think about is it's allowable if it's a direct cost associated with the actual performance of that employee's duties and is not somehow reflective of other costs that the entity, the employing partner, has to pay just to keep the doors open. Pay to keep the doors open, copies, trucks, administrative support, above office support by like the CEO, those kind of things, those are administrative. They cannot be included in the rate. Anything that is directly tied to the producer payment, or excuse me, partner to staff payment is potentially eligible. The 75-25 also applies to partner contributions? No, we have no specific required mix of FA and TA with respect to contributions. If you look at the ranking criteria, you'll find that FA contributions may buy you a little bit more ranking consideration than TA ranking considerations. And in fact, TAI may provide you more bite than TAE. Again, we're looking at the program from a purpose of installing FA to benefit producer resource concerns. So the impact of FA is probably going to be the greatest. The impact of TAI is going to be next, and the impact of TAE is going to be lowest, but all are eligible contributions. And we have no specific requirements as to ratio. How many, I'm down to 4 minutes and I've got 3 questions. Maybe I can do it. How many conversations would you recommend having with state conservationist coordinator while preparing a proposal? I'm going to say just the right number to feel like you've got the information you need. And I don't know how many that's going to take. I know that sounds snarky, but I think it really depends more on the partner's level of detail in the proposal and how well they've thought through what TAI capacity they have in NRCS terms than, everybody doesn't start at the same place. So you can't have one number. Partner still confused. Can you address paper performance? Let's see what they say. Can you clarify whether FA would cover both practice implementation costs and performance compensation, or only performance under a pay performance? So the trick there is we can't pay for the same activity twice. So if we are paying for a practice with FA, then we're not going to pay for pay performance, because pay for performance is an alternative to paying for the practice. It's an alternative valuation methodology authorized by the Farm Bill. It is not authority to pay for the same activity twice, and it is not authority to incentivize the producer's installation of land management practices via pay performance. It really is just the option to pay differently. And if only performance, can other federal funding sources be used to pay for practice implementation? So other federal funding sources that are non-USDA would potentially be viable as contribution to a and paid by a partner to a producer to get the practice done. Maybe that's not a duplicative payment as long as it's not USDA. If it's USDA, it's a duplicative payment and it's an ineligible contribution. So the specifics there matter, and it's another conversation with your state coordinator. Can remote staff performing technical analyses outside of the multi-state project area be included in the partner contributions? Somebody found an answer. It looks like all partner contributions must be expended within the no, I'm not going to help with that. Can remote staff performing technical analysis outside of the multi-state or CCA project be included in the project contributions? Yes, as long as the activity that they are doing is eligible. And that's going to boil back to, is it TAI to support a producer contract in the project area? Well, sure, you could design a project from somewhere else. You clearly can't check it out, but you could design it from somewhere else. So depending on the task they're doing, it could be eligible as TAI. Similarly, TAE, you could do project management and inform that from somewhere else. But it has to be related to the project, and you have to actually be doing it, or you're just fluff. And what if that pay for performance is to extend beyond the 5-year time frame? It's a really good question. I'm glad somebody mentioned it. Nothing in a AFA project can extend beyond the 5-year project, well, the approved project term, which can be longer than 5 years if you request it during the proposal and are approved. Nothing can be delivered after the term of the project and be credible either as contribution or for RCPP reimbursement. That doesn't mean the partner can't continue the efforts after the RCPP project is over. But if they do, it's pretty much on the partner at that point, because all of our RCPP payments are strictly limited to the term of the RCPP project, and the activities for which they are being paid out must be complete. So you can't have a contract that extends 5 years out past the end of the PPA and make a lump sum advance. No way, not allowed.
This is Sarah, the moderator. If you wouldn't mind jumping to the very last slides, just flash up our survey one last time. I want to say thank you, Seth, so much for sharing your expertise. Thanks everyone who participated for your great questions. We have shared the resources earlier in the chat, and here's the link one more time to the survey. Thanks so much for attending our session today.